Hi, everybody. I'm Bob Bowman, Editor-in-Chief of Supply Chain Brain, and I'll welcome you to this presentation on building trust in supply chains, presented by Deloitte. One quick reminder, there will be an audience question and answer session at the end of this presentation. Audience members are encouraged to submit their questions at any time during the presentation by clicking on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Now, research tells us that best-in-class supply chains are, on average, 6 times more trusted than their lowest-performing counterparts. That's why building ecosystem trust in the face of unprecedented challenges like product and labor shortages, workforce shifts, and accelerated digital transformations is critical to business success today. So today, we're going to learn what steps you can take to build trust in your supply chain ecosystem. With that, I want to introduce our speakers for today. Ashley Reichheld is Trust Leader for Consulting with Deloitte Consulting LLP. She created Trust ID, a groundbreaking system to help companies measure, predict, and build trust with their customers, workforce, and partners. Ashley is the lead author of the Wall Street Journal bestseller, The 4 Factors of Trust: How Organizations Can Earn Lifelong Loyalty. And Laura Carpenter is Supply Chain Network Operations Senior Manager and Trust ID and Supply Chain Lead with Deloitte. Laura leads Trust ID in supply chain, helps large organizations digitize and transform their supply chains with an approach that is anchored in the 4 factors of trust. So with that, I want to turn it over to Ashley Reichheld. Ashley, take it away.
Thanks, Bob. We're really excited to be here. We're passionate about the topic of trust and want to share what we've learned so that everybody can work on building trust in supply chains. Want to start with a little bit of background here. Not surprising for those on the phone, trust is at an all-time low, and you probably feel this in your day-to-day environment. Organizations like Gallup and Pew have been studying trust for the last 40 years, and the consistent thing you notice is that it's been on a downward decline. That's true of Congress. It's true of big business. It's true of our schools and our media. So looking around to your left and right, I'm sure you're surrounded by some things you trust, but probably far more that you don't trust. That's important because trust eases the friction that we face when we try to work together. So having trusted relations creates more productivity and creates more productive relationships. We'll talk a little bit about today about the secret behind that and how you can unlock it to put trust to work for you. But before we do that, never in any of these conversations has anybody said, oh, but Ashley, trust isn't important. Of course it is. We all intuitively know that it is. But in case you need further evidence, some stats for you on the left and right. When workers trust their employer, they are not only 1.8 times more motivated to work, they're also 50% less likely to leave and much more likely to take on additional work and responsibility. The same is true on the customer side. Customers who trust the brand that they're using are 1.4 times more likely to buy new products from that brand. They're also substantially more likely to pay more money for that service, and they'll come to your defense on social media. But the challenge with trust is that it's not very well understood. When we ask leaders how much they think their employees trust them, their answer is that this many people trust them, when really it's only this many. Employers overestimate employee trust by about 40%. And it's even more dramatic on the customer side, where we overestimate customer trust by 50%. So we know trust is really important. We know it's low, and we also know there's a pretty significant gap between how trusted we think we are and how trusted we actually are. We set out as an organization to help other organizations solve this problem. We wanted to break down trust into the component pieces and parts that help you take action against it. After all, trust is that essential bond that allows an organization to create relationships with its workers, its customers, and its partners. And per Bob's earlier point, it drives financial value. The organizations that are the most trusted outperform everybody else by up to 4x. But here's the rub. How do you define trust? Well, we've conducted extensive research to understand that. We started about 3 years ago, and since the beginning of our work, we have studied over 500,000 respondents in both B2B, B2C, in supply chain. We've looked into sustainability. We've taken a look at DE&I. If it was available to study, we have done our best to do so. It was really important to us to create something that was science-based. so that we can understand why people are doing what they're doing and how we can shape and influence what that means. All with the effort of building trust. It is one of those things that not only creates financial value, but it creates the kinds of organizations we all want to be a part of. So, how do you define trust exactly? When we run this with our clients, we actually will hand out pieces of paper and say, okay, everybody, write down the definition of trust. And if I have 10 executives sitting in the room, I will get 10 totally different answers. One person will write down, oh, it's when people keep their promises. Another person will write down, it's when I can show up as my authentic self at work. Another person might hand in a blank piece of paper and say, oh, I know it when I see it, but I couldn't write anything down. That was the basis for how we thought about creating the 4 factors. How can we create a methodology and a toolkit for leaders to break down the components of trust to understand how to build it? Welcome to the 4 factors. In all of our research, we uncovered that there are 4 things that drive trust. Trust is human, and it doesn't matter whether you are in the United States or in Australia or in Europe. These are the factors that are human level. It doesn't matter if you're a customer, it doesn't matter if you're an employee. This is how we build trust. You build trust when you make a good promise, which we describe as intent. You do that when you demonstrate empathy and kindness, treat everyone fairly. That is the humanity factor. And of course, you need to do that transparently. You need to be able to openly share information, make sure you're including your motivations, why you're doing something, give people the information they need to make a choice. We joke here, by the way, that it's not transparency for the sake of transparency, it's relevant transparency. Think about it this way. If you go to a farm-to-table restaurant, it's super cool to hear about how the farmer grows their food. Who's the farmer's family? What do they like? It adds texture and color to the meal. But you draw the line in knowing, say, the name of the animal that you're eating. Some things you just don't need to know. So relevant transparency. Now, you have to be able to keep your promises to earn trust, and you do that when you have the capability to do so. So the kind of quality products and services that we need, as well as you do that reliably. You consistently deliver against your promise. Those are the 4 factors of trust, and those are what drive the behaviors that I showed you on the earlier page. When our workers trust us, when our customers trust us, when our supply chain partners trust us, they do the kinds of things we are excited about them doing.
This presentation is being brought to you by the Global Supply Chain Marketing Summit. As a marketing professional, ensure success by building trust through content development. This allows your branding, lead generation, and online strategy to be more impactful. The Global Supply Chain Marketing Summit helps enhance your strategy and plan for the next 12 months to increase visibility beyond your industry circle. That's June 5th through 7th, 2024, at the Ritz-Carlton on Amelia Island, Florida. For more information, go to globalsupplychainmarketingsummit.com. With that, I want to pass it over to Laura Carpenter. Laura, it's all yours. Do we have Laura? There she is. Hi, Laura. Laura, you're muted. You're muted.
Thank you very much. For some reason, with the controls, my video and mute.
That's okay. It happens. Take it away, Laura.
Thank you very much. So, hi everybody. Thanks again for being here, and we are so excited to tell you about how we took some of the great insights around trust, and specifically the 4 factors of trust research that Ashley walked you through, and applied it to supply chain ecosystem relationships. Because intuitively, as supply chain operators and leaders, we know that trust is core for actually delivering on our commitments to our customers and our partners at the end of the day. And we were really curious to see and better understand the importance of each of those 4 factors of trust that Ashley mentioned for particular relationships in the supply chain ecosystem. So about a year ago, Ashley and I teamed up to gather some insights about trust, and specifically we dug into 4 different relationships. We looked at the 4 factors of trust first for the relationship between a B2B customer and suppliers. So what was the relative importance of humanity or transparency or capability or reliability? And then we also looked at the inverse. So how much do suppliers trust their B2B customers? Next, we also looked at the trust relationship between what we kind of think of as corporate supply chain or operations teams and frontline workers. So these are the folks who are showing up to their job every day in a plant or in a facility, because we know that the trust between those two different groups is really important for ultimately achieving aspirations in supply chain. And then finally, we know that as supply chain folks, we do not work in kind of a black box. We have to interact all of the time with other departments within your company's organization, whether that is finance or marketing or IT or sales. And we were curious whether there was a link between trust scores and performance. So we went into this external research with a core hypothesis. We wanted to understand and test whether supply chain organizations that had stronger trust relationships with their customers, with their supply base, and with their internal and external employees had stronger performance or not. So, unsurprisingly, we were really kind of delighted to see in our results that this came through. But before we dive into the specifics, I want to talk through a term that you're going to see on some of the following pages that we call a trust score. And this gets into a little bit of the methodology of our research. But what we did when we were surveying these different relationships is we would ask our survey respondents a particular question to quantify things like a humanity score. So as an example, we would survey a frontline worker from the supply chain or operations group and ask a question: do you agree with the statement that the people who work in corporate supply chain functions at my company demonstrate empathy and kindness towards me? And then we looked at the net difference in the percentage of respondents who strongly agreed or agreed with that statement, and those who strongly disagreed or disagreed with that statement. And so what you'll see on some of the results that I will get to in a minute is that you can actually have a range in trust scores from a negative 100, which would mean that all respondents strongly disagreed with that statement, indicating low trust, or a positive 100, indicating that respondents very strongly agreed with a statement, and that corresponds to a high trust score. So I mentioned that core hypothesis. We wanted to test and understand whether supply chain organizations with the highest trust scores were also the highest performing supply chains. And as Bob shared at the beginning of this webinar, that was absolutely true in our survey results for these 1,500 respondents. We found that high-performing supply chains on average had 6 times higher trust scores than low-performing supply chains. And what was even more interesting about that is when we dug into the data and looked specifically at the relationship between trust and performance for those kind of 4 different categories that I mentioned, the link between trust and performance held throughout. So I mentioned 6 times on average overall was the difference between high and low performers. That gap was even larger if we looked at the relationship between customers and suppliers, but it was also there for the relationship between trust and performance if we looked across departments, if we looked at the relationship with frontline employees, or if we looked at the relationship between suppliers and their customers. But we wanted to know even more about these results and specifically the 4 factors and whether some factors had stronger links to performance than others. So the way to read this graph is, we have each of the 4 factors here shown on a bar chart. On the left, we've got reliability, then humanity, and then capability, and then transparency. And on this graph, the leftmost bar indicates the average trust score for supply chains that we categorize as best in class or high-performing supply chains. And then that bar chart on the right represents the trust scores for supply chains that were low performers, or what we called in a worst in class category. We saw consistently the largest trust gaps or difference in trust scores between those best in class and worst in class organizations for the reliability factor. which means that while there is a strong link between trust and performance for each of the 4 factors that Ashley described, we actually saw the strongest link for the reliability factor. And furthermore, what was interesting about this is if we looked overall at all organizations and did not segment by high or low performers, and we just wanted to see, which factor has the lowest trust scores for supply chain organizations, that was reliability as well. So put together, this means that while reliability of all of the factors matters most for supply chain performance, it's also the factor that supply chains struggle the most with. And intuitively, this makes sense. If you think about, especially recently, all of the complexity that supply chain leaders are having to navigate and deal with, whether it is geopolitical conflicts or natural disasters or cyber risks, there is a lot of complexity that is continuing to require additional supply chain resilience to deliver on commitments consistently to customers. So one takeaway that we had here for supply chain leaders is reliability is a factor that is very difficult, but when done right, it can lead to very, very strong performance and great results. But let me talk about specifically ways to build reliability. And as an example, I'm going to talk about the relationship between supply chain organizations and frontline employees. We actually have data that can go this deep for other relationships within the supply chain ecosystem, but this is one that really jumped out as being important in our survey results. And as a reminder, when we talk about reliability, we are talking about consistently delivering on promises and experiences. What we found when we actually looked at specific behaviors that were highly correlated with high reliability trust scores in our survey results were that a couple of behaviors rose to the top. First, it's very important when interacting with supply chain and frontline employees that those employees believe they can count on the people who work in corporate supply chain at their company to improve policies and procedures in support of frontline employees. We also found that it's very important for frontline employees to feel that company leaders are committed to and accountable to the frontline workforce. And finally, it was important for frontline employees to feel that people who worked at their company supported them in addressing issues that they raised. When we think tactically about what this means in day-to-day, there are all sorts of ways that as supply chain leaders, we can continue to increase these reliability trust scores with employees, but things like providing promised pay despite schedule changes, encouraging open discussion between employees and leadership, having consistency in day-to-day responsibilities, more consistency in shift schedules is a good example here, transparency around clear paths for leadership progression, and fair and consistent compensation and benefits really matter for building up these reliability trust scores. But reliability was not the only factor that really caught our attention when we were digging into some of our trust and supply chain data. We were also really surprised to see how much humanity mattered, particularly for operation employees as well. So again, reading the chart on the left here, we are showing those average trust gaps, and specifically these are for relationships between frontline workers and corporate supply chain teams, or the relationships within a specific company or organization across departments. So you can think of these as what we call internal relationships. We're looking within the 4 walls of a single company. We found that when we looked specifically within one company, humanity's trust gap was just as large as reliability's. And then when we pair that with some of the insights that Ashley shared earlier about the links between trust and humanity with things like retention and motivation, you can see how much this really begins to move the needle in terms of supply chain performance. We saw in our data and in our results that employees are actually 2.6 times more motivated at work because of humanity, or when they rate humanity highly. And this is important because, so often we are trying to figure out what new technology we can implement as supply chain leaders to drive a strong ROI, or how we can better squeeze additional savings out of an additional relationship. But if you think about humanity as a lever to actually drive business results, we have found that there is a very strong financial return when you can drive retention improvements, drive productivity improvements, just through things like treating your frontline employees with empathy and with kindness. Humanity is also a really important factor for supply chains because the importance of humanity is likely to increase over time. When we dug into this data and looked at humanity scores specifically across generations, we found the link between humanity trust scores and performance to be particularly heightened for younger generations, including Gen Z. And we also know from a recent survey of Gen Z employees that 1/3 of Gen Z employees feel like they're not cared for at work. However, when they do feel like they're cared for at work, they're 3.3 times more likely to actually look forward to coming to work, and they're less likely to have plans to leave their job. And if we think specifically about supply chains and some of the challenges that many organizations face with labor shortages or with aging workforces, it is really helpful and important to understand that focusing on something like caring for employees can have a substantial impact on retention, on, again, motivation and performance. And it's a really, really important lever for addressing some of the broader workforce challenges that many of us are facing today. And so I want to talk for a minute about building humanity with employees as well. So the way that we define humanity is this is demonstrating empathy and kindness towards me and treating everyone fairly. And empathy and kindness, again, are not always the first words or phrases that come to mind in supply chain and operations, where many of us think a lot in terms of numbers or schedules or capability and reliability. But again, we're all human at the end of the day, including supply chain employees, including suppliers, including our customers. And because of our human brains, things like empathy and kindness really influence the way that we interact with one another, and even how we do business with one another as well. So when we're looking at building humanity with employees, it's very important to treat workers, and I'll add suppliers and customers as well, with respect. Respect doesn't always mean you have to give pay raises. It doesn't always mean that you have to say yes to everything. But again, as humans, we intuitively know when we are being treated with respect versus when we're not. So think about that in some of your interactions with your teams. It's very important for employees to feel like their supply chain leaders in their company care about their well-being. If you're thinking about manufacturing or operations environments, things like ergonomics here can really matter, ergonomics and safety. And this was something that was true as well if we looked across departments. So I don't know how many of you on this call frequently interact across supply chain and IT. That's something that we see a lot with our clients, but continuing to treat folks who work outside of your organization with respect and fairly makes it a heck of a lot easier to collaborate across silos and to drive a lot of progress towards some of the bigger goals and initiatives that require collaboration across different departments. If we get even more tactical with this and think about ways to potentially enhance humanity, you can think about things like offering, encouraging, and respecting the use of paid time off, facilitating mental and physical health checks, celebrating personal and professional wins, As an example on the celebrating wins, I was speaking with a maintenance manager a couple of weeks back, and he mentioned how much it meant to him when his supply chain VP sent him a note congratulating him on his anniversary working for the company. Little things like that matter and drive retention, improvement, and loyalty. Training frontline supervisors to lead with authenticity and inclusivity, and then standing up and supporting diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts to show support for underrepresented groups. And so in a minute, we want to open it up for some additional questions and answers. But, again, as Ashley mentioned, trust has been declining over time. We know that trust very much matters for performance. And when we dug into those results specifically for supply chains as well, we found that it really matters, particularly those reliability and humanity factors.
Fantastic, Laura. Thank you so much. And I'd like to bring Ashley Reichelt back in now for the panel discussion portion of our discussion. And I have the privilege of asking you folks some questions before we actually get to the audience questions. And by the way, that does give me the opportunity to remind our audience that you will be participating at the end of this presentation. Just click on that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen at any time during the presentation with your questions. Let me start with Laura. This is an interesting question because of all this talk of humanity. What about AI, which is kind of a, not exactly humanity, and especially generative AI? It's such a popular topic these days. How does the rise of generative AI affect trust in supply chain?
Yes, it's a great question, Bob. And what's interesting about AI, and often it's a common misconception, is we hear AI and we think about machines, but so much of the work and the value associated with AI transformations, particularly within supply chain, comes down to the human side of it. AI and driving value from AI work often comes down to trust and adoption. Put simply, if humans, and particularly supply chain end users, don't trust their technology, they won't use it. And as Ashley's great research has shown, trust is actually the #1 driver of human behavior when price is not a factor. So if organizations are looking to actually drive adoption for some AI technologies, they need to ensure that they are earning trust. I'll give a very specific example here. I've been working with a large transportation company over the past 3 years to actually deploy an AI solution around predictive maintenance for equipment and machines. And, in terms of the work and the effort associated with scaling this solution in production across their organization, I'd say maybe 30% of it was around data science and data engineering. But what has been more important and essential for driving that business case is kind of what we actually call our change management work, which is all around building trust with end users so that when they receive an AI-generated alert or recommendation to fix a piece of equipment, they trust it and they will actually go out and act on it. And then they trust the team behind the AI work enough to provide feedback back into those models to enhance performance over time. So trust and AI are inherently linked, and driving value comes down to ultimately trust and adoption in many areas.
Laura, could I also ask you a quick question about the methodology of the survey? When you're assessing whether frontline workers are, quote unquote, cared for, or the various levels of satisfaction, are you presenting them with are you asking for a yes or no answer, or are you giving them like a sliding scale or multiple choices in their response?
Yes, Bob. So they had a sliding scale with answers ranging from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And then when we calculated trust scores, we looked at the net difference between responses that were in that agree or strongly agree category versus the disagree or strongly disagree category.
I figured you were going to address it with nuance, but I thought I would just ask anyway. Ashley, you talked about the importance of trust, especially the humanity factor, and you say it's likely to increase over time. Can you elaborate?
Happy to. So one of the things that we look at is who trusts where. Trust isn't equal, actually, and different groups trust in different ways. One of the most surprising differences is with younger generations. Younger generations, like millennials and Gen Z, for example, are substantially more influenced by intent, which includes humanity and transparency, than older generations. In fact, when millennials and Gen Z believe that a brand cares about their impact on the planet, they're 27% more likely to purchase it versus older generations. And really interestingly, that belief, that intent score, actually influences capability scores. So those same younger people are much more likely to rate capability and reliability higher. In fact, I think it's a 260% increase. So as these younger generations start moving into roles with decision-making power, we're going to see the importance of humanity ratcheting up.
Ashley, in your presentation, you talked about employers overestimating worker trust by almost 40%. And a lot of the other people I've talked to in the industry would bear that out. A lot of disconnect between what employers' priorities and understandings of the employer-employee relationship is and employees' understanding of what it is. Why are leaders so bad at gauging employee trust?
You know, it's not about intent, actually. It's funny because most people really do have very good intentions. The challenge of the disconnect comes down to how we build trust as individuals. Trust is built when you manage expectations well and when you have agency. So expectations are easy, right? If I have an expectation and you don't meet it, you're going to lose my trust. And as you get more developed in firms, then you're able to set your expectations better. You know what's coming, you have more influence over it, which actually brings us to the second one, which is agency. When people have more agency over the decisions, they're more likely to trust them. Now, think about how that works in an organization. As you grow up in your organization, you become more senior, you have more agency over outcomes, and you know what to expect. So naturally, what you see is a pretty significant increase in trust. That means that our more senior leaders are much more trusting than our much more junior leaders. So there's already a gap between how well our leadership thinks of trust and our junior people. And we have to keep that in mind. While my trust has been well established over the 20 plus years that I've been in the industry, our junior practitioners haven't had that time and experience to build it and trust less. Now, there's a question about diversity in here too, by the way, which is trust is not equal, and we can talk about that a bit later. But women actually tend to overestimate trust a little bit less than male colleagues. So if you're in a senior position, think about the fact that your junior practitioners don't trust as much as you do. And if you're a male or female, think about the fact that you might have a bias towards trust one way or another.
It can't be a coincidence that a lot of the crisis in the talent shortage these days is focused on frontline workers, because your scores here certainly would indicate that there's a reason for that. And I also like the fact that built into your model is a potential solution to that disconnect, and that is the whole idea of empathy. Communications. If you have empathy, you understand better what your workers really want and how they're really feeling. So that's a great connection that you make. Laura, how can we begin incorporating these trust conversations and results into our current supply chain ecosystem relationships?
The first thing that I would recommend is spending some time thinking about the definition of trust and the drivers of trust, specifically the 4 factors that Ashley introduced: humanity, transparency, capability, and reliability. Because when you understand trust and what drives it, it is easier to actually take action to build, or in some cases, rebuild trust for critical ecosystem relationships, whether it's with suppliers or customers or frontline employees or other departments. So, we recommend actually stopping and reflecting on some of your relationships with many of your important supply chain partners. So, think of a supplier, maybe whom you've got an upcoming negotiation, or you're working on a new contract, and think about, how you would actually assess or score your trust in that relationship. What would they say? What would they say about you? Would they rate you high in humanity and transparency and reliability and capability? And then what about the inverse? Because when you understand and think about trust this way, it is much easier to then begin to identify and act on some of the gaps that you may have. Are there things that you could do to build and be more transparent with a supplier? Are there ways that you can demonstrate a little bit more empathy or humanity in your interactions? Maybe it's jumping on a phone call or a video call or even an in-person meeting rather than just an email back and forth. And all of this stuff, again, can really help to drive positive outcomes in these interactions that you have with your ecosystem partners. And finally, we think that on top of reflecting, it's very important to actually measure and baseline trust scores for these different relationships. So Ashley and her team have actually made their Trust ID platform with the 4 factors of trust open source. So you can download actual surveys that you can use to benchmark trust scores at the 4factorsoftrust.com. We recommend adding them into your talent surveys. We actually know that trust is so behaviorally driven that we have a patent pending tool set that actually allows you to predict behavior from some of your customers or other partners to a high degree of accuracy, meaning that if you actually measure and understand these trust scores, you can often predict actions that some of these relationship partners will take. And then once you have the actual data, as I mentioned, make use of it. So hold trust workshops to actually come up with your own action plan or roadmap for building or rebuilding trust scores. Bake different findings into your employee engagement surveys or your strategic plans, but measuring it is a really key and important step to taking action.
Your research certainly identifies a critical need for taking these steps, because even your highest scores are like in the area of 70. Relatively, that looks fine, but for a glass half empty guy like me, 70 is a C on a test. So a lot of room for improvement here, and I love the advice you're giving us as to how to move forward with that. I'm going to move us now to the audience question and answer portion of our presentation now, and I do want to remind the audience that even as we are answering the questions that you have already submitted, you are welcome and encouraged to continue to submit questions by clicking on that Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many of your questions as we can, time permitting. Let me start with this one, it's for Ashley. You briefly mentioned intent and competence as qualities linking the 4 factors of trust. Can you further describe the relationship and role specifically in Trust ID?
The 4 factors are what generate trust. And again, trust is when you make a good promise and you keep that promise. So hence the intent, humanity, transparency needs to be delivered with capability and reliability. Now, those 4 factors, interestingly, go together. It's very unlikely to have somebody who's great at humanity, but terrible at capability, or great at humanity and terrible at reliability. If I'm not showing up for you reliably, do I really care about you? Am I demonstrating empathy for you? So keep in mind that they tend to move in similar ways. I will also say that most organizations fall down on things like transparency, and clearly in supply chain, reliability is a big driver. So you have to pay attention to where your own strengths and weaknesses are, as well as what the 4 factors tend to generally do.
Laura, the question is, it's interesting that reliability has the largest trust gap between high and low performers, yet it's also the factor with the lowest overall trust scores. Mm-hmm. Why are supply chains so bad at building reliability?
Yeah, it was interesting and exciting to us to see the strongest link between trust scores and performance for the reliability factor. And our hypothesis is a lot of it is tied to the increased complexity that supply chain leaders are having to manage. If we think about all that has gone on in the world the past few years, whether it is the COVID pandemic or semiconductor shortages or natural disasters or geopolitical conflicts, there is a lot at play that makes it really hard for us to deliver on our promises in a consistent, consistency is a big part of how we define reliability, in a consistent manner to our customers. But what we found is when supply chain organizations were very good at reliability, or they had high reliability trust scores with some of their ecosystem partners, and they were the top performers. So this tells us that leading organizations are actually taking a lot of this complexity and a lot of the disruptions from the past few years and turning it into a competitive advantage. If you can figure out how to build supply chain resilience and how to, better predict or develop contingency or action plans to handle and manage the unexpected, it really can set you apart from some of your competitor organizations. So supply chains are bad at reliability, but done well, it really moves the needle.
Sure. So Laura, again, question is, what is your perspective considering how trust impacts supply chain decision making?
Often we like to think that when we make decisions in supply chain, we do it based on facts and we do it based on data. But again, and we'll keep revisiting this point, we are humans at the end of the day, and there is so much that happens subconsciously that drives our decisions and our interactions with others. Think about some decisions or interactions you may have had with others, again, in the supply chain ecosystem. How much did your relationship with the person on the other side of that conversation matter, and how you interacted and what you promised to share and how you were actually kind of negotiating or dealing with a partner? When we like someone or when we trust them, we're apt to do more to help. Interestingly, we actually have some stats that bring this to life even more. So if we think about trust and some of those 4 factors of trust, we can tie it to changes in business behavior. So when customers resolve issues in an adequate and timely manner, building trust, suppliers are actually 1.2 times more likely to sell at a reduced margin to that customer. Or when suppliers, if we look at the inverse, resolve issues in an adequate and timely manner, building trust, customers are 1.3 times more likely to actually pay more to work with that supplier, even when there's a cheaper option available. So remember that we make decisions kind of with the human side of our brain and with numbers, but too often we overlook the human side.
Ashley, this research has obviously established that trust is important. In your experience, though, what specific methods have worked well for companies that are successfully building trust with their employees?
The companies that are best at building trust are the ones that are taking a data-driven approach. It's easy to mistake intent, and it's easy to think you're doing the right thing when really you should be doing something else. And I can give you an example. One of the organizations we're working with right now is part of the DoD, so the Defense Department. I won't tell you which branch of our great DoD, but one of them. And they were trying to encourage their contact center to just act with more humanity. So telling your folks when you call in, just be empathetic, treat them nicely. And that had a great impact, by the way. They were thought of as very, very human. Unfortunately, though, they were also thought of as wildly incapable. So you call up and you speak to somebody who's being really nice to you, but you're not really sure if they're going to do what you need them to do. So we worked with that organization to help move the needle on it, and just doing some simple things like send an email with the follow-up of the 3 things that you're going to do after the phone call. And we ended up improving those capability scores by 177%. So not just a little bit, but an order of magnitude higher, just by understanding A, what's the data telling us about the problem, and B, what's the simple action we can take. Doesn't have to be complicated. Sometimes the easy answers are the right ones, but in this case, it was just uncovering the challenge behind the driver.
I see. Ashley, again, in your experience, what do companies typically get wrong when it comes to trust?
Intent. So companies want to do the right thing, but they don't often know what that is. And so, for example, we've been working with a media company to help them with their subscribership, which they turn over, almost 30% every year. It's huge. And they're doing all the right things, but they're not targeting them to the right people. So, for example, take an airline example that we have. Passenger A is low on humanity, and the right solution for her is to waive the seat fee. Let her sit by her kid. Passenger B, same loyalty score. So on face value, you might not know this passenger is any different, but he has a low reliability issue because he sat on the tarmac for 3 hours. So you should treat him like a human. But in this case, you probably should make up that 3-hour delay. Give him drink vouchers, give him mileage credit, whatever it happens to be. Companies often have all the right things, but they need to make sure they're getting into the hands of the right people.
Laura, some of the conclusions from your research, it just seems like common sense. It seems obvious. So what's the goal with widely publicizing these results?
we thought it was so important to back up some of these findings that, as you mentioned, intuitively jive with what we would expect, but we wanted to back them up with data. Because when we think of actually communicating the importance of trust at all levels of the organization, from the C-suite on down, data really matters for getting points across. It is easy in a conversation, particularly with supply chain executives, to say, oh, trust matters, or, oh, we should act with empathy or kindness. But too often, some of these softer concepts get put to the side because they are not explicitly tied to a business case, or there's not hard data behind it. And we thought it was very important to quantify some of these topics that are a bit more qualitative in nature. So when you can say, not only does, trust matter or isn't important, but hey, high performing supply chains actually have 6 times higher trust scores than low performing supply chains. It gets a lot of attention, and particularly with all of the focus in supply chain on topics like resilience and AI transformations, we wanted to make sure there was hard data backing up the importance of trust.
Thank you. How can these principles be communicated? I mean, obviously, it's sort of a top-down thing. That has to start with the leader, right? But how do you successfully kind of get these principles all the way down through all levels of the organization, from the C-suite on down? I'm wondering, I don't know, maybe Ashley, talk about that?
It's tricky because trust is owned by everyone in the organization. It's not
Sure.
that we can have a CEO who owns trust only and the organization can just do what it wants to be outside the CEO. Similarly, if our managers are creating great trust, but our leadership breaks trust, that's also a problem. So the challenge with trust is that it is multifaceted and owned across the organization. Similarly, across the C-suite, our supply chain is responsible for delivering reliably, on time, quality products and services that we are all expecting. Our cybersecurity chief is going to make sure that that data is protected and safe and secure, and that our customers aren't exposed to a potential risk. So it really does take coordination across the different parts of the organization, both functionally as well as up and down the organization. Now, depending on where you sit in the organization, there are lots of things you can do. So if you're not in a decision-making position today, but you're working with a team, think about the things that you can do immediately today with your team. For example, how can you show up more reliably for your team? Are there ways that you can demonstrate your humanity for your team? Is it just wishing people happy birthday? One of the things I like to do, for example, is whenever we kick off a project, I sit down with my team with something we call the placemat, and we actually go through what we like about what we do, what kinds of work we'd like to do, when we like to work. Are you a morning person? Are you an evening person? If I text you at 7 a.m. and you're an evening person, man, I think you'll probably be furious at me. So understanding that in advance helps not only indicate that it's important that I care, but it also helps me act in ways that build trust with my team. Now, let's say you are a leader in the firm. One of the things I encourage you to do is go get the data. To the point made earlier, you can download the surveys on the 4factorsoftrust.com. We have purposely made them open source because it's our mission to help organizations become more trusted. And we'd encourage you to ask your customers, ask your partners, ask your employees, and then act on what you find. Building trust is as simple as understanding where you've lost it and then making intentional choices about building it in the future.
Thank you. Maybe another one for Ashley. His question is, how do you create trust, and especially how do you promote humanity in a multicultural environment where the leadership and the operation workforce have different values and needs?
Gosh, that's tricky, especially as we become more diverse. That becomes a challenge. And actually, let me start by saying that trust is not equal. One of the things that we did a lot of research around is who's trusting and why. And I was shocked to learn, in fact, I ran the analysis 4 times, that demographics are not, in fact, a primary driver of trust. I really thought, for example, that we would see ethnicity highly linked to whether or not I'm trusting. What we learned is that it's not our demographics, who we are. It's actually how we've been treated. So what impacts trust mostly is your lived experience. And let me bring that to life just with a personal story really quickly. My partner is Dutch, and we couldn't live in the States for, the vast majority of our 20-year marriage now. And when we finally were able to come home, we decided to have kids. A crazy journey that's become. We are both on the birth certificate here in Massachusetts, but in Ohio, we're not recognized, my partner's not recognized as a parent. This poses a real problem for us because when we go to visit my parents in Ohio, it means that if one of my two type 1 diabetic kiddos has to go to the hospital, she doesn't have any decision rights over how they're treated and how they're admitted, for example. In fact, she might not even be able to see them if the nurse is having a particularly bad day. So in order to safely visit my parents, we had to adopt our own kids. That doesn't mean that gay people don't trust, but when you're treated that way as a gay person, maybe it does impact your trust a little bit. And you see that play out in trust scores. So we encourage organizations to take a look at what we call those trust flags, whether they're sexual orientation or ethnicity. You might not find differences right away, but keep an eye on them, because at times when there's fractional things happening in the background, wars going on, race riots, they do pop to the forefront, and they are things that we have to be considerate about. And you can build trust with one group and not lose it with another. It doesn't necessarily matter that you share the same values. If you treat people with empathy, kindness, and respect, you're able to manage beyond that anyway.
This question brings up something I guess we have to talk about when we talk about automation versus humanity, and kind of asking if it's a sign of humanity when frontline workers are replaced with robotic solutions, pushed and as humans pushed to their limits by management in pursuit of higher profits. Obviously, those are qualities that you're arguing against, at least that last part. Could you address it, though, at least just what the concern that this particular questioner has about the idea of automation taking over from humans, and the idea of humans being pushed to their limits in an environment that is anything but full of trust? Maybe Laura.
Yeah, sure. So when we think about automation, we actually often talk about the idea of humans with machines rather than humans versus machines. So if we think about some of the kind of challenges or some of the parts of jobs that maybe less human actually for frontline employees, or may just kind of be less enjoyable overall, it could be things like unsafe working conditions. It could be monotonous tasks. It could be doing work that frontline employees feel isn't a good use of their time or isn't actually driving impact. But what we have found is that when you can use digital tools or automate certain tasks or routines in a way that actually frees up or enables frontline employees to do safer, more meaningful, and more human work, that's when you really see great outcomes. To bring this to life a little more, one example that we see and have helped many organizations with in supply chain is around using AI and specifically computer vision to flag safety incidents in manufacturing environments. So you can actually use cameras to alert or identify potential collision risks, to flag different kind of operation kind of techniques that may be unsafe, and then actually provide a report to operations managers so that they can conduct better training or address the root cause of some of those incidents. So AI is not replacing humans. Ultimately, humans who figure out how to work with AI are the ones who are going to drive more value. I don't know, Ashley, if you have anything you want to add.
That was so well said. I would only add that we should also recognize that AI is treated with deep suspicion. We have done research, for example, to understand how do humans react when AI is in the picture. Mm-hmm. And when people know that they're engaging with AI, their trust goes from a net positive score to a net negative score. So we have to understand that people are treating AI with deep suspicion and they don't trust it immediately. So just so you know, these are the exact same scenarios. Scenario with AI, scenario without AI, huge difference in between. This does not mean that we shouldn't go after AI. Of course, it's a huge opportunity that we all need to be pursuing. But keep in mind that we have to work on using trust to help build AI and build it to be trustworthy versus letting it erode trust.
Thank you. By the way, Ashley, quickly remind us where our listeners and our audience can download this survey. You mentioned it.
Go to www.4factorsoftrust.com and you can download the surveys. There's also a great way to play around with some of the data that we've collected, as well as other resources, articles, and so forth. And again, They are free to download. We are eager for everybody to use them. So we hope you check it out.
Great. Thank you. I have bad news for everybody, and that is that we're almost out of time. It's been a fascinating discussion, but we have time for just one final question. I'm going to pose it to both of you. Let's start with with Laura. Laura, you start. What is one actionable thing that this audience should do differently at work based on today's discussion?
Yeah, put simply, just remember that kindness matters. So when you show up at work, when you're interacting with others, just remember that humanity is one of those core 4 factors of trust. And think through your interactions. Am I doing this in a human way? Am I doing it in a kind way? We always talk about the golden rule, treat others how you want to be treated. Make sure that carries through in your interactions with your supply chain groups.
Ashley?
I would just add on to that one of the things people often get wrong with humanity is the importance of vulnerability. As a leader, we can't make ourselves invulnerable because then people think that they can't make mistakes. Remind people that we're actually all human. It's okay to make mistakes. We as individuals make mistakes, and make it easy for your teams to come to you with that in mind.
Thank you so much. What a relief to hear that we don't need to accept organizational dysfunction. We don't need to accept worlds and organizations based entirely on transactional thinking. And this has just been a fantastic presentation with some really valuable information for everybody. Thank you so much, Ashley and Laura. Really appreciate it. So here's some information for you coming up, audience, additional resources that you can avail yourself of. Here's 3 QR codes, one for building trust in supply chains, an article. Another is the Trust ID website where you can download some tools. And I just lost that last one, which would be a link to the book, the Wall Street Journal best-selling book that is called The 4 Factors of Trust, How Organizations Can Earn Lifelong Loyalty. So again, thank you, everybody. Really appreciate your participation. Thank you, audience, for your great questions, and have a great day.